Angelica looked at the wedding photograph. She and Edward had been married for 3 years. Just think how quickly time flies. She looked at herself so happy in a wedding dress. She was distracted from her memories by the squeak of an SMS message. It was her husband reminding her that she needed to donate blood today. Then she received a notification about a bank transaction. Money had been received on her card. After 3 years of marriage, Edward writes to her only to supervise the blood donation, but not for himself, but for Ursula. Over the past month, the girl donated blood 3 times. This is much more than her body can bear. Yesterday, while she was waiting for him from work, she stood in the rain for more than an hour and now felt like she was feverish. A message arrived when Angelica took the phone, saw a photo of her husband and Ursula, where it was written that last night he was with her, and a note with humiliation that Edward had not looked at her as a woman in all 3 years, and she was an empty place. The phone beeped again, a voice message from the mother-in-law, who told her daughter-in-law to hurry up and prepare dinner since the maid had a day off today. The girl could barely hold back her tears. Her husband's family treated her like a servant, and she endured everything for the sake of Edward. But this photo from Ursula was the last straw. It was the last kick to her self-esteem. As a result, the young woman picked up the phone and resolutely dialed her husband with the message that they were getting a divorce. In response to his words about what kind of circus she was organizing, Angelica said that if he was not at the registry office in an hour, Ursula would die. After she hung up, a message came about another replenishment of the card. Our heroine smiled. That's how he wants to keep her. An hour later, they were sitting in the registry office, where Edward could not understand why she was unhappy. Yes, she donated blood 3 times in a month, but he compensated her for this. Angelica understood that he was a loser. He really did not understand her pain and humiliation, and she resolutely demanded a divorce. What she regretted was the 3 wasted years. Edward hurried her that it was time to go to the hospital. The girl resolutely said that even if this trash died in front of her in the hospital, she would no longer give up a drop of her blood. Edward frowned and reproached her for such words, reminding her of the marriage agreement according to which she must donate blood at any time. The girl, grunting, resolutely left the building and headed to the car. Edward looked at her back and did not understand how she could change so much in a day. The nurse asked about Ursula's well-being. She smiled sweetly and answered that the wound hardly hurt and she was much better. At that moment, Angelica entered the room with a determined look, followed by Edward. Looking ingratiatingly at Edward's wife, the patient babbled that she didn't expect to see her here today, but she needed her blood. Angelica, looking at her coldly, demanded an answer. It was she who sent the photo and SMS in the morning. Ursula looked confused and asked what photo she was talking about. At that moment, Angelica swung her hand and hit Ursula in the face. She screamed, distorted with anger. By what right did she behave this way towards her? Our heroine again began to resolutely approach the girl. Edward resolutely blocked her path and told her to stop immediately, while Ursula, sobbing, repeated that she had nothing to do with the photo. Angelica coldly threw the printed photos at Edward's face. The man took one of them and asked in surprise where his wife got them, while Ursula sat looking scared. Edward looked at Ursula menacingly, asking if she had anything to do with all this. He himself commented that yesterday he actually fell asleep in the ward because he was tired. Ursula tearfully said that she could swear on the name of Alex, his best friend, reminding Edward of the oath Edward made to his best friend in the army to take care of her. After these words, he turned to the girl and, putting his hand on her shoulder, asked her to calm down, assuring her that Angelica was just very worried, so she took it out on her. Turning to his wife, whom he divorced an hour ago, he said that he needed to quickly donate blood. The main thing was Ursula's health, and he could talk about the photo later. Smiling contentedly, Edward's ward thought that he was still choosing her, and Angelica was again in the air. When Angelica asked the doctor standing next to her whether the patient really needed a blood transfusion, she became nervous and nodded in the affirmative. He added that Miss Ursula had fallen, had wounds on her legs, and was in urgent need of a transfusion. Angelica thought about it and said that there was no need to rush so much. In 2 steps, she found herself at the patient's side and jerked back the blanket to reveal her bandaged leg. She fought back as best she could, But the young woman showed everyone a small abrasion by tearing off the bandage, mockingly adding that the wound was not even bleeding. Then she sarcastically added that she arrived in the ward too early. She just needed to walk a little, and everything would heal. Edward looked menacingly at Ursula, who made excuses that she was really sick, and blood transfusions were helping her recover. Angelica, leaving the room, told them coldly, "Let them look for a new fool for a walking blood bank. She's had enough." The girl went out into the hospital corridor and tiredly sank down on the sofa. She was so exhausted. How hard it was for her. Choking from tears, she dialed the number from which her older brother's painfully familiar voice answered her that he would pick her up soon. When Eugene arrived, his sister was sleeping on the hospital couch. The man carefully took his sister in his arms and, accompanied by guards, carried her, looking worried at how thin and pale she was. Accompanied by security, he carried her sleeping out of the hospital. At this time, in the ward, Edward was talking to a noticeably nervous doctor, scolding him for this whole situation with a transfusion due to some kind of abrasion. Edward pondered the current situation and thought that he had indulged his ward too much. Apparently, his wife misunderstood his relationship with Ursula. He decided to explain himself and close this problem. If Angelica felt safer, he would keep his distance from Ursula. Going out into the corridor, he gave the order to his guards to find his wife. After 10 minutes, he was informed that Miss Angelica was nowhere to be found. Edward thought about it. She doesn't have a penny. She can't just pick up and leave. Then he ordered that his wife be found wherever she was and brought to him. The estate of Angelica's family was located in a picturesque place surrounded by cherry blossoms. The heiress opened her eyes in her room. She sat in bed and looked in front of her. There was such a pleasant and long-forgotten feeling of home. The girl began to cry, thinking that she had finally returned. Her parents entered the room. Angelica, with tears, rushed into her father's arms. The father looked at his child, who grew up in love and affection, and who gave 3 years to a man who did not value her at all, giving up her status as the heiress of a rich and high-ranking family. When the girl cried, her father reminded her of the agreement. If in 3 years she did not fall in love with Edward, she would take over her family's company. The returning daughter promised her father that she would not be the same as before. Her parents would be proud of her. Suddenly, she was almost knocked to the floor by a cheerful girl hugging and kissing her. It was Angelica's best friend, Martha. Martha, looking into her friend's eyes, said that Edward would regret exchanging pearls for fish eyes. The girls held hands as in childhood and smiled happily when Angelica noticed that there were documents left in her ex-husband's house that needed to be picked up. The grand family mansion was a gray, solid building, the complete opposite of the open and light mansion of the Angelica family with large windows. Martha volunteered to accompany Angelica. As soon as they entered, they were greeted by Angelica's ex-mother-in-law with an embittered face. The woman noticed that she was now a nobody here, a stranger, and therefore let her get out, just like Martha shamed the woman by hinting at her manners and upbringing. But Grace, that was the name of our heroine's mother-in-law, added with derogatory contempt that her former daughter-in-law was one of the non-entities who marry wealthy men. Angelica didn't have time to answer anything before Grace angrily said that she had been enjoying a luxurious life for 3 years for the money of Edward's family, although she herself was from a dysfunctional family, and finally called the girl a dirty beggar. Unable to restrain herself any longer, Martha jumped up to her. Grace wanted to slap her in the face, but the girl pushed her onto the sofa, shouting that her family was rich with dirty money, and this house was dirtying her and Angelica's shoes. The former daughter-in-law calmly walked towards the stairs, and Grace, distorted with hatred, screamed that she would throw her out of here, to which Angelica coldly snapped that she would do it herself as soon as she collected her things. Getting up, the girl cheerfully added, "What a fool she was, leaving her dignity for the sake of this family. If not for Martha, Grace was ready to chase her daughter-in-law." When the girls had collected the documents and left, Grace shouted that there was no turning back, even if she didn't dream, and said cheerfully that she had divorced her precious son. As soon as Edward stepped foot in the house, his mother immediately asked about the divorce. He stared at her in surprise and asked how she knew this. Having learned from his mother everything that had happened, Edward told his mother that the girl had not asked for a penny, to which the mother angrily remarked that someone like his now ex would not miss hers, which means she was hatching a plan to rob them. Edward sadly realized that his family hated Angelica, but he didn't even notice it. On the contrary, he believed that she was treated well, so maybe she filed for divorce because of his mother. Going up to the room, he saw her bank card, realizing that Angelica only took her things. At this time, his mother flew into the room screaming that the necklace called the Lost Dream was missing, and she knows that the thief is none other than this beggar woman whom they warmed up. While Grace was screaming that she would call the police, his gaze fell on their wedding photo with Angelica. The man realized that in 3 years of marriage, he had never given her jewelry. When Edward barked that his mother didn't dare call the police, she angrily said that she would deal with her without the police. At this time, Angelica and her friend returned to their mansion. Martha was indignant at how Grace behaved, to which Angelica replied that everything was in the past. Suddenly, they caught someone's gaze. Eugene was sitting on the sofa with a book in his hands and looking at the girls. Angelica ran up and pressed herself close to her older brother, asking where he had been for so long, to which the man noted with a gentle smile that there were important matters in the company. Then he added that he had prepared a gift for his sister and handed her a package with a new model of their development, which had not yet been released for sale. Afterwards, he approached the embarrassed Martha and handed the gift to her too, since he knew that she would come with his sister. Martha blushed. Eugene did not take his eyes off her. Angelica watched this picture, realizing that they were in love with each other. It was obvious. Afterwards, the girl began to ask where their other 2 brothers were, but according to Eugene, everyone was busy with projects and could not come yet. But he himself would introduce her to the company's affairs. At night, Angelica was awakened by a phone call. Martha's number was displayed. Martha started babbling that the entire internet is full of news that Angelica stole a necklace from the Grands, and they set a condition for returning it by tomorrow, or the police will arrive. Our heroine lay there and could not utter a word. Even from them, she did not expect such meanness. The girl read the news. They wrote about her as some kind of beggar who had never seen money. As a thief, the comments were full of gossip and speculation. Angelica interrupted the speaker Martha, who, after another line, was typing her in anger, and said that she would find a way to put an end to this gossip. She dialed Eugene and asked who runs their brother's entertainment company. Although the company is registered in her name, the relative wanted to help her sister, but she said that she would do everything herself. The next morning, posts appeared on the internet that a private detective had found out that a certain miss was wasting money in a world casino, and a photo of a girl in a casino, and a necklace next to her. The young woman's gaze stopped at that photo on the phone, where her now ex-husband and this impudent person, a painful stabbing in her chest. Well, the next piece of information for the people is ready. The girl tiredly closed her eyes, thinking about how blindly she got married and who her husband really is. In the morning, Edward called an assistant and shouted indignantly at who dared to send the news on behalf of the company, to which the employee replied that according to the Hayoung entertainment law, the news must be displayed for 24 hours. They cannot remove it before that. Edward could not understand how this was even possible, how his wife got such opportunities. He called his father and told him to delete the statement about the police. But on the phone, he heard his mother's screams. The screams of the mother continued, who shouted that if only this brat, that is, his now ex-wife, would appear, and she would teach her a lesson. When Edward said that his wife was not to blame, she screamed hysterically that the girl had disgraced them all. Edward replied that he could just apologize. In the end, her mother accused her of stealing, but it was not her fault. Realizing that the relative could not be convinced, the man hung up and asked his people if they had found his wife, but received a negative answer. He flipped through his wife's posts, where she posted the idol of their 3-year marriage. Here's breakfast, and this is him picking her up from work. At that moment, he realized that he didn't know her at all. While he was scrolling through his feed of posts, the images began to freeze, and then everything was deleted. He realized that his wife, already ex-wife, deleted the entire history for 3 years. 3 years of marriage were simply erased. He narrowed his eyes angrily and, looking out the window, hissed that he would get Angelica wherever they were. Edward walked arm in arm with Ursula, surrounded by crowds of people, journalists, camera flashes. But he is the head of a large corporation and is obliged to appear in society. He shook hands and uttered standard phrases. Meanwhile, Ursula held his arm and was incredibly happy. She was with him at such an event. Another luxury car drove up. Eugene got out. People began to whisper. And Edward, seeing that a woman was about to get out of the car, was surprised, since this gentleman had never been noticed with women before. What was Edward's surprise when he saw that the stranger was Angelica? She was magnificent. A luxurious black dress emphasized her graceful figure. Expensive jewelry added gloss. It was time to move on to the banquet, but he could not take his eyes off her. Surprise, admiration, some kind of internal fire engulfed the man. Angelica, looking at her ex-husband and his companion, thought how quickly she had gotten the hang of him. Seeing where his sister was looking, Eugene calmly said that his older brother was nearby, and there was no need to be afraid, to which the girl replied that it was not she who needed to be afraid. When Angelica and her brother caught up with Edward and Ursula, her ex shook hands with Eugene, noting that he had heard a lot about him and introduced himself. The president of a large corporation, Edward Grand, looked at his ex-wife, who behaved like a real aristocrat, amazed at her changes. Ursula watched her partner's gaze and realized that she could not lose him again because of this girl. Then she sarcastically added to Angelica what she was doing here. Such places were expensive, but she had no money. Her brother remarked that Miss Ursula must be the daughter of some boss, to which she stated that Angelique had recently divorced her Edward. Eugene besieged Ursula by noting that his companion, despite the divorce, is not prohibited from attending such events. Ursula was embarrassed and noticeably nervous, not knowing what to say. Angelica looked at her derogatorily and said that she had no idea that she needed to report on her movements to anyone, much less to her. As a result, Edward, with downcast eyes, did not know how to continue the conversation, and Ursula, having lost confidence, again felt the lifelong status of a mistress. Eugene decided that it was time for him and his sister to move on, and said loudly enough so that Edward's girlfriend could hear that President Grand needed to choose his companions better. Edward kept turning around to look at his ex and her new man, thinking about how quickly she forgot him. Angelica went up to the roof of the hotel, where the pool was located, and enjoyed a cocktail while looking out at the evening city. Ursula approached her from behind and began to inquire why she had appeared at this party, concluding that it was obviously to get closer to Edward. Her rival again pricked her with the status of a mistress and that the whole city knew about it. Then Ursula declared that Angelica was just an abandoned woman in a rented dress and jewelry. Here, Angelica's patience came to an end. She calmly looked into the eyes of the boorish woman standing in front of her and declared that she had asked for it. A few seconds later, Ursula flew into the pool. At her screams, the guests came running. Edward and Eugene stood in front of everyone. Angelica remembered how everything happened again 3 years ago on the day of her wedding. Ursula insulted her by saying that Edward married her only to donate blood and was also thrown into the pool by Angelica with screams. She thought, wow, it happened again. Meanwhile, Ursula screamed and shouted that they wanted to kill her and asked for help. And just like 3 years ago, having abandoned Angelica, he again rushed to save this scoundrel. The young woman remembered herself that day. How painful it was for her when, before her eyes, Edward worried about Ursula with such care and tenderness, pulling her out of the water. When Edward pulled Ursula out, she saw people and decided to play virtue, and lamented that Angelique was not to blame. She didn't do it on purpose. Angelica burst out laughing, and looking at the dumbfounded Edward, she said how much she could fall for this trick. After which she defiantly climbed onto the balcony and threw a wad of money at Edward, saying that she had returned the favor to her ex, and mockingly advising him to hurry up before others took it all. Edward told the sobbing Ursula to wait in the hallway, but he paid no attention to her protests. Edward decided to find his ex-wife and talk to her. He was told that she was with her companion in the ballroom. Entering the hall, he saw Eugene carefully feeling Angelica's ankle. Edward called out to her sharply. The girl was about to rise, holding the hand extended by her older brother. Eugene, seeing Edward's face, which showed irritation and anger, noticed that the man apparently had clearly not come to console his lady. Edward flinched when Eugene placed his hand on Angelique's shoulder. Edward, trying to restrain himself, said that she could tell him everything if she had any complaints, but not take it out on the innocent Ursula. Angelica grinned mockingly and contemptuously when she heard that she should apologize, saying that if not, he would probably push her into the water or hit her too. In response to his words about kindness and the fact that they were ex-spouses, the woman coldly said that she was cruel by nature, gritting his teeth with anger. Edward jumped out of the hall. Eugene looked at his sister and tried to understand whether she still had any feelings for this man. Angelica understood this from her brother's eyes, and grinning, assured him that she had overcome past mistakes. Edward was driving in the car and was silent. He wanted to think about everything, but at this time Ursula plaintively begged him to believe her. She was not to blame for anything. Suddenly, the driver pointed his finger at the billboard on which the scene was scrolling by the pool on the roof of the hotel. The entire city could see and hear what actually provoked Angelique to send Ursula into the water. And the finale was the sound of a splash and Ursula falling into the pool. Edward clenched his fists and ordered the driver to stop, his companion screaming and begging him to let her explain. She screamed that his former abnormal person would not have put all this on public display otherwise. Edward turned to her and said that today was her last stay in the city. The man looked at the screen of the city billboard, where the scene by the pool was scrolling again, and wondered what was true in his marriage. Had Ursula been lying all this time? A car horn sounded, and his friend Louis, a rich playmaker who was married, slowed down next to him. A friend offered to let him down and commented on what was happening on the screen, concluding that it was right that he divorced this girl. Otherwise, she would have ruined his family. Edward barked at him to stop, but his friend was not offended at all. A second later, he even suggested going for a drink and relaxing, to which Edward agreed. A few days later at night, Angelica and her brother sat in one of the most elite restaurants in the city and discussed the lessons that a girl should take in the company in order to get up to speed. The brother offered to join the company Julie, which has a project. The girl happily expressed a desire to try her hand. Eugene noted that he would soon be going abroad on business, but their third brother would return and be able to help her. Angelica beamed. She would see her brother. At that moment, behind her, she heard a loud female squeal about how she ended up here, calling the girl trash that needs to be thrown out of such a place. The manager tried to calm the guest down, but she pointed at Angelica and shouted that she had disgraced her in front of her friends and exposed her as a thief whom the police were looking for. The manager looked at Angelica and Eugene as he greeted the president. Grace's ex-mother-in-law supported the girl, shouting that she was thrown out of the Grand family. So what right does she have to be here? Here Eugene intervened, saying that they had bad manners and an amazing ability to turn everything around in general, an unscrupulous family. The women screamed even louder for the couple to be thrown out of the restaurant, to which the manager replied that the main shareholder of their restaurant was sitting in front of them. Angelica reassured the manager with a smile, assuring him that there was no point in ruining such a magnificent dinner because of these women. The girl, whose name was Laura, turned purple and said that they didn't care what position Angelica had achieved. She could deprive her of her job in the city with a snap of her fingers. When Angelica asked what she wanted about her, to which Laura, with a malicious smile, ordered to first apologize and pour wine, in the end, she was no stranger to it, saying that she served their family anyway. Our heroine sighed and calmly agreed, took a wine glass and poured red wine. Laura was bursting with pride and self-satisfaction. She was sitting at the table when red wine suddenly poured onto her head. Angelica bent down to the amazed girl and asked her to remember that she had filed for divorce, and if she heard at least one rude word from anyone again, then life would seem unkind to her. The ex-mother-in-law, running up to her screaming daughter, yelled obscene expressions at her ex-daughter-in-law and demanded a waiter. Approaching her brother, Angelica noticed that the air in the cafe was bad, and it was worth going to the VIP room. All the visitors looked at Grace and Laura, and a muffled hum was heard throughout the room. In anger, Laura Grand hissed after the departing Angelica that she would never forgive her for this. As soon as Edward drove up to the restaurant after them, Laura, a capricious little girl, wailing, rushed to her brother, telling her how this scoundrel had humiliated her in front of everyone. At this time, Angelica and her brother walked arm in arm to their car. Laura made an angry grimace and said that she got her into trouble. Edward walked up to his ex-wife and took her hand. Edward thought that she couldn't just pour wine on his sister and asked for an explanation. Angelica replied that she really poured red wine on his boorish sister. Laura rejoiced and asked Edward to make this scum kneel in front of her and apologize. The ex-wife smiled and looked slyly at Edward and asked if he really wanted her to kneel. Then she turned around and told President Grand that the recordings from the restaurant's cameras were available at any time, and added to Laura that she was behaving so pitifully, given her shady dealings, which her family had always covered up. The older brother added to Laura that if you attack, be prepared to answer for your actions. Laura whined like a little girl that she was accused of being the thief of that necklace, which she did not steal, but simply took. She is a family member, and she just said a few words no more. Our heroine smiled contentedly and told them that she was not the obedient sheep she was before, and if this happens again, the punishment will be different. Eugene repeated about round-the-clock access to camera footage. Edward simply looked at the speeding car and did not recognize his former quiet, careful, and gentle wife. Laura began to talk about the fact that she was simply teaching a lesson to the bastard who had been fed and clothed by their family for 3 years, to which Edward barked at her to stop. Edward demanded an explanation from his sister about the necklace, to which she replied that, anyway, his wife had nowhere to wear expensive jewelry, and she was his sister. Edward decided to watch the video from the cameras, and Laura yelled that Angelica was probably hanging out with this guy while she was still married and was supporting him with Edward's money. Edward told her to shut up. Looking through the CCTV cameras, he saw the full picture and thought that his family had humiliated his wife throughout their marriage. Angelica's retaliatory strike, of course, shocked his mother and sister, but it was fair. In the end, he watched to the end in silent thoughtfulness. Then he turned to his sister and said that judging by this video, they constantly bullied Angelica. Now they need to apologize. Laura screamed that she would rather die than apologize to this rubbish. Edward sternly added that the man who was with his ex was a very important person in the city, and she wouldn't dare talk to him like that in the future. Laura grimaced with anger. Well, that's how it all turned out. She took the phone and dialed the number, saying that Angelica was humiliating her and she needed help. Angelica sat in her office listening to information from a trusted person that the Grand Company, through sources, hired a person to photograph her and put her in a bad light. The brother came up with coffee and asked if they needed help, to which the girl replied that she could take a photo if they wanted and smiled. The young woman drank coffee and praised her brother that no baristas in the world could compare with his coffee. Then she added that she was starting to work at the company tomorrow and needed the help of the vice president for a few days to get up to speed. Martha suggested going to a bar and having a good time to celebrate this event. Angelica thought, why not? While the girls were dancing, someone threw a pill into the glass. When the girls returned to the table, Angelica said that she was going to the restroom, and Martha took a glass of cocktail and began to drink. The satisfied guy watched her with a grin. When Martha drank almost all of it, he approached her, hugged her cheekily, asking if the cutie wanted to have some fun. Angelica came out from the restroom and saw some guy pulling her friend off the table and trying to take her somewhere, and something was clearly wrong with the girl. She bravely stepped forward and in an orderly tone demanded that her friend be released. The impudent man, grinning, said that after she herself drank the contents of the glass. At that time, a red-haired girl approached Angelica and whispered that this was a famous bandit. Angelica replied that she should let her friend go so she can drink. The bandit pushed Martha, who could barely stand on her feet, away and thought about how much fun he would have today. Angelica asked the red-haired visitor to take care of her friend for now. Our heroine took the glass, turned away pretending to drink. At that time, the impudent man had already extended his hand to her. With a sharp movement, the girl hit the boor on the head with all her might with a bottle of wine. Then she professionally twisted him so that the guy begged to let go, screaming in pain. The visitors froze in admiration, admiring how the girl tied up with a strong man. Then Angelica took a glass of red wine and ordered the guy to drink it, or she would pour it down his throat. He tried to resist as best he could, muttering that he was wrong. In the end, Angelica forced him to drink a whole glass. Then she shook off her hands and said that it was unpleasant to meet scum like him. Then she approached the red-haired woman and thanked her for taking care of Martha. Following the departure of Angelica and Martha, the girls and boys whispered admiringly that she was not a knight, but a real queen. At this time, the secret stranger was taking a photo with a satisfied smile. Then he called on the phone and said that he had taken beautiful photos of Angelica beating a guy in a bar, which would destroy her reputation on the internet. A guy sitting at a table in a restaurant with a wry smile ordered it to be published. Lewis smiled and believed that now this ungrateful fox, who had insulted Laura and humiliated his friend, would pay for everything. The next morning, Martha burst into Angelica's room as she was getting ready for work, shouting angrily that the girl was being banned from the internet again. Angelica, combing her hair, wondered why she was banned and what happened again. Marta began to say that a video had been edited online of Angelica beating a guy in a bar, and people began writing negative comments, and showed the video on the phone. Angelica was calm and told Martha just not to look. Then she wouldn't have to be nervous. But the friend was determined to resolve the situation if they hated Angelica because of her. At this time, the butler approached and said that the driver and car were waiting for the miss, to which the heiress replied that she did not want to attract attention and would go to work like everyone else. The butler proudly added that the gentleman had ordered the cars, but they were still on the way, but she could take any working one from the latest models of Maserati Porsche. Angelica thought with a grin that in her family such models are called workers. The butler asked Martha to take care of the young miss. At this time, the company was about to announce a new director when Eugene entered the conference room with Angelica and introduced the girl as the new director of the company. One of the employees turned purple with anger. She had worked in the company for so many years, the position should have gone to her. She came forward and asked what Miss Angelica's talent was, other than the fact that she was the adopted daughter of a rich family for 3 years. The girl said that she would not work in such conditions, to which Eugene calmly noted that it was her right, and she could leave. The employee turned pale with anger. "This is necessary. Mr. Eugene prefers this new girl to her, the one who has given years to this company." But then, she apologized and asked for forgiveness for such an impulsive attack on her part. And having already pulled herself together, she added that she respected the company's decision and would work with Miss Angelica. Watching the new boss leave with evil eyes, she thought that she would remember everything. Because of her, she made herself look like an idiot today. At lunchtime, a happy Martha came into the office and said that she had whitened her friend's reputation by putting the phone in front of Angelica. A full video with all the details was circulating on the internet, where commentators admired Angelica, noting that with such a friend, you don't even need a boyfriend. When Angelica asked where she found the full video, Marta just smiled contentedly and added that one call decided everything. Then the girls laughed, and Martha added that she would not allow anyone to criticize her friend. Angelica thought about it when she heard that Louis, her ex's friend, was behind everything, which means Edward was involved in this too. Angelica said that she would repay this boor, and Martha happily reported on the incriminating evidence she had stored up. She showed a photo of Louis in an embrace with 2 girls, clearly not of a business nature, just at the time when he just got married. Angelica published this photo and signed that she does not arrange secret surveillance and invites Louis to meet openly. The girls laughed, anticipating an interesting show. Louis flew screaming into Edward's office, poking him with a photo on his phone, shouting that his wife wanted a divorce and arranged this for him. Edward looked and calmly added that Louis was the first to humiliate Angelica on the internet, and she only answered him. Louis could barely contain himself from hysteria, exclaiming that he only wanted to teach a lesson and did not know that the video was cut off. When his friend said that he wanted to avenge Edward's sister, he only added that his sister did not learn from her mistakes. In response to his friend's lament that he was being kicked out of the house, Edward replied that it was all his fault, and he needed to apologize to the one he wanted to annoy. When his friend said why he should apologize to this hypocrite, Edward stood up and said that it was time for him to go to a meeting. Let him do as he knows. As a result, Lewis sent an order to the communications department so that an apology would be made to Angelica on behalf of his account. Martha showed this to Angelica with pleasure, noting that the guy turned out to be flimsy and not 2 hours had passed. At this time, there was a knock and an employee entered the office, who was indignant in the morning and asked to talk to the new boss. Angelica said that she had no secrets from her friend. Then the woman apologized for the incident in the morning and asked permission to bring Miss Angelica up to date. She put the project in front of the girl, assuring that it would help her gain a foothold in the company. Angelica thought this was a suspicious step. Angelica said that she would think about it and asked to call her Miss President or President Angelica. The employee chirped hypocritically, thinking that this upstart was acting this way because President Eugene supported her. The woman left the office, and Martha and Angelica began to discuss this action. Marta was indignant at the way she was talking to the new director, to which her friend noted that she could not calm down with the fact that she did not get the director's chair. Martha cheerfully promised to figure out what was happening here. Then she added that she and her friends had a chat where they secretly criticized Edward when Angelica was married, and today everyone is going to celebrate the divorce, and she invites her friend to join. Edward and Louis arrived at the nightclub in the evening after seeing Angelica and Martha. Angelica and her friend also thought it was not a very successful and pleasant meeting. Martha sarcastically remarked that Louis shouldn't have come to such places after everything that was happening, and he, in turn, added that now Miss Angelica has a rich patron. Martha mockingly added that after relying on her husband for 3 years, her friend was now relying on her friend. The girls turned around and walked away, deciding not to waste any more time. Edward looked at his ex-wife, thinking about what she was doing here, and it was time to finally explain herself. Their friends were sitting with Martha and Angelica, who reported that in a few days there would be a grand show. Let Angelica take her third brother and come. The guy was the head of a large corporation, and the pretty girl was the founder of a world-famous brand. Angelica thanked her friends and promised to come. Edward and Eugene approached their table and greeted the group. Namely, Eugene was interested in the heir Chuck Jr. and invited him to go and play with him. Chuck, calling Angelica his queen, asked if she minded, to which the girl shrugged it off and said that the Maniacs group would soon arrive and she would go downstairs to listen to them. The 3 girls stood up and decided to leave, since the company of Edward and Eugene was unpleasant to them. Edward kept his eyes on Angelique leaving. When the 3 of them were left at the table, Edward asked Chuck what kind of relationship he had with Angelica. He took a sip and simply replied that they were friends. Louis said that people like Angelica simply don't know how to be friends. Edward clenched his fists and ordered his friend to shut up, and Chuck Jr. looked at Eugene and asked if he knew what kind of person Angelique was. Louis sat there looking beaten, his best friend not supporting him at all. At this time, their conversation was interrupted by loud voices, and the musical group Banda Maniacs arrived. The girl fashion designer gave Angelica a violin and said that the violinist from the group was in the hospital after surgery to remove appendicitis. Without the violin, everything would not be the same. Let her play. At first, Angelica was taken aback to play the violin in the group so suddenly, but the confusion quickly passed and she agreed. The guys sat and discussed the release of the Banda Maniacs group. They said that the group was taking a break, and they were invited here for a tidy sum. The guys froze when they saw a beautiful, slender girl masterfully playing the violin in the group. They opened their mouths when they realized it was Angelica. Edward watched what was happening in surprise and could not believe that his ex-wife played the violin like that. The band's lead singer thanked the violinist and said that she performed amazingly and was a true arranger. Martha ran up and handed her friend a bouquet of flowers, declaring that she was her goddess. The musician noted that he felt as if he had seen the girl before. Angelica stood happy with flowers, thinking about how many such pleasant moments she had missed during 3 years of marriage. Martha suggested returning to the table, hoping that Edward and his friend had already left. But they were mistaken. Louis waved his hand at them with a cute smile. There was an awkward tension. Martha was angry that the 2 never left. Angelica calmly sipped her drink. When Louis remarked that they didn't know that Angelique could play the violin, Martha quickly cut him off by saying that they were not obligated to report on all her friend's talents, when suddenly Louis suggested playing dice. Edward looked at his wife, noting how bright and independent she had become, but still caught her former, but already so distant features. As a result, unexpectedly for himself, he challenged her to play dice. Angelica smiled and replied, "Why not?" In the end, what would happen if she played with her ex-husband? The girl said, smiling. Marta got angry and tried to dissuade her friend because they wanted to provoke her. Louis sat with a smug smile. He knew that Edward was the best at dice and always won. Our heroine asked her ex-husband what he wanted to play. Before Edward could open his mouth, Louis shouted that if she wins, he will leave here naked, and if she loses, then Angelique will have to publicly admit that she married his friend for money and never appear in the city again. Angelica agreed with a smile. Edward gave in to spin the dice first. The girl took the glass and stirred. Then he also made a professional gesture with the glasses, under which there were bones and Edward. Next, it was Angelica's turn again. She was absolutely calm, absolutely not nervous or worried. Edward didn't take his eyes off her, wondering if it really mattered whether she won or lost. Louis watched with joyful anticipation of victory. It was in their pocket. This girl was messing with the bones unprofessionally. It was immediately noticeable. It was Edward's turn to show the result, and he raised his glass. They rolled 3 to 6. It's obvious he won. Louis smiled and winked at his friend, saying that we were giving it away. Only Louis, smiling meaningfully, sat waiting. Edward's friend was already rejoicing. Martha lost her temper and said that her friend could not lose. Carefully, Angelica turned the glass over to reveal the result. Marta gasped in admiration. "It can't be, friend. You're super." Edward was amazed at the result. It was impossible, and Louis thought he was going to have a seizure. The girl was left with 4x6 and 1 unit, an absolute winning combination. While everyone was sitting in a daze, she stood up beautifully and said that she would be getting ready to go home and let the others play. Edward acknowledged Angelica's victory with the soft smile of a loser. And Martha approached Louis, who was lamenting that this couldn't happen, and reminded him that everyone was waiting for him to come out naked. In desperation, he tried to accuse them of cheating, but Martha, with her eyes burning like a predator's, said that you need to be able to lose, and looked at Edward. Louis begged for help with a pleading look, but Edward calmly said that the promise must be kept. He realized that they would not let him get away with it. His friend was leaving, forcing him to pay with his promise. Martha and Chuck Jr. approached the poor fellow, rubbing their hands with pleasure. The guy looked so pitiful and tried to beg forgiveness for the bet. Angelica stood at the exit, waiting for the car that her older brother had sent for her. Suddenly, she heard her name, turned around and saw Edward. He was standing calm, but still a little nervous. The girl asked what Mr. President wanted from her. Edward apologized for his sister's behavior at the restaurant, telling her that he had watched the surveillance video and his sister had behaved inappropriately. The girl managed to tell him to control his family when she was interrupted by the cry of Louis jumping out naked. Angelique took it on her phone with a smile, saying that this was a photo for memory. Louis yelled why she was taking pictures of him, to which Angelica cheerfully remarked that it would be a sin not to capture such a scene. A car pulled up behind her. The girl casually told Louis that if he dared to contact her, these photos would be on the internet. Edward, looking at her, noted that it doesn't matter whether she plays the violin or whether she plays the dice. This is no longer the Angelica he knew. Quiet, sad, resigned, and kind. And he looked at his ex-wife for a long time until Chuck Jr. approached him. He asked Edward. He didn't expect such a turn. He didn't deny it and nodded, to which Chuck noted that 3 years is not enough to get to know a person well. He further added that he doesn't need to understand her. She is the best among them. When Edward asked what plans he had for Angelica, the guy admitted that he liked her, and since she was free, he wanted to become her boyfriend. Edward tried to hide his indignation, and Chuck thanked Edward for letting her go and opening the way. Louis shouted from the car not to waste time on empty chatter and went to the car. Marta and her friend looked at the guys and believed that they needed to be taught a lesson for Angelica. Otherwise, they would not calm down. When Chuck approached, Marta asked how Angelica knew how to play dice like that. Chuck, who was a classmate of the girl, said that when they were studying, Angelica had a fight with her family, and they stopped sending her money. And then she was deceived into working as a croupier in the largest underground casino. She gained experience and earned a lot of money. Her family got scared and gave her a black platinum credit card, only for her to leave the casino. After these words, Martha said what a pity that she didn't study with Angelica. Edward was driving in the car and thinking about Chuck's words. He wants to hit on Angelica. I wonder if she likes him too. Looking at his friend's serious and thoughtful face, Louis asked if he was angry, to which Edward replied that he needed to worry about his naked photos. Chuck's next words that his ex was such a bad choice. She never belonged in their circle. Edward sharply pressed the pedal. Barely hiding his anger, he ordered Louis to get out of the car, saying that he was going to the company. When Angelica came to the company in the morning, one of the subordinates reported that Miss Leah was waiting in the office. Reporting the upcoming negotiations and schedule, they entered Angelica's office. The picture of Leah sitting in Angelica's chair, looking like a boss, made them freeze for a minute on the threshold. In order to somehow attract attention, the employee coughed, since the woman did not even hear them. The employee jumped up, and Angelica, in a cold tone, ordered that this chair be delivered to Leah's office since she liked this chair so much. She awkwardly tried to justify herself, but Angelica snapped back by saying that she was clean and would not sit in a chair after others. The same Leah, who was applying for the position of vice president, angrily thought that this bitch just slept with the president, and that's why she got the position. Then she handed her the documents with a creepy smile, noting that this would be a great deal. The director with whom the contract would be concluded invites them to dinner to sign the deal. Angelica found such obsequiousness very suspicious, but it was impossible to simply refuse. After the employee left, she gave the contract documents to the assistant and told her to raise the commission by 30%. Suddenly, Martha appeared in front of her with a huge bouquet of roses asking for help. When asked what kind of bouquet this was, Marta winked slyly and noted that her friend clearly had an admirer. The girl took the bouquet in bewilderment, wondering who they might be from. Then she gave it to an assistant to take to another office, since she couldn't stand the too concentrated smell of flowers. After which Martha quietly said that she found out about the Fenton company with which they are offering a contract. It is a shell company that owes a lot of money, and this Leah is definitely trying to set a trap. Angelica thought that another enemy was trying to trample her, so the evening would not be boring. Marta shared the good news. Her mother bought a cosmetics company, offering to work there. This is her dream, so the poet will no longer be able to accompany her friend to work. In the evening, Leah took her boss to a business dinner, declaring that it would be private. So for their own good, she did not take the secretary as a third. They entered the office. Leah loudly greeted the man sitting there. The director of the company, Fenton, was a small, bloated, repulsive-looking man. When he kissed Leah on the cheek, Angelica shuddered in disgust. Leah obsequiously introduced the vice president, offering to waste no time and sign the deal. They sat down at the negotiating table. Leah said since Miss Angelica was new to the company, she didn't know that she and the director were old friends. She was noticeably in a hurry to sign the document quickly. When the man opened the document, he became nervous and sweated. She and Leah unanimously exclaimed who changed the terms of the contract with a percentage increase. Angelica, calmly and confidently looking at them, added that she was the vice president of the company. Chuckling nervously, Leah stated that she had prepared everything and calculated why she was not notified. To which Angelica replied that she is the vice president and has the right to change everything at her own discretion. The employee was a bundle of nerves and said in a trembling voice that this is a business. Honesty must be observed. Angelica noted with a smile that apparently the personal interests of Mr. Director and Mrs. Leah were involved here. The director, smiling slyly, handed over his version of the contract, saying that this is 10% less than Madam Leah's. If Madam Vice President signs, then this 10% will be hers. Leah noted that Angelica should find as many sponsors as possible. She told the girl that her clothes from the internet and the way she gets to work by bus show that the president is not going to marry her and does not value her at all. So what is the use of serving someone who gives me pitiful crumbs? The woman stood up and said to think about her words. The director would give her an Audi, even if it was a used one. But if they worked together, he would get much more. As she left, The woman grinned evilly at how she had pulled off the whole thing by putting the drug in Angelica's glass. In the corridor, she called a worker whom she had bribed and asked if he had done what she ordered, and he nodded in the affirmative. The guy then asked in a trembling voice if this girl was not President Grand's ex-wife. At this time, Edward was listening to them behind the wall and was simply amazed when Leia chuckled and said that she had been thrown out of that family, and now she had nothing to do with them. She ordered the guy to mind his own business and remain silent. Edward was overcome with anger and indignation at what he heard. His only desire at that moment was to prevent misfortune. He waited until Leia left in order to catch the employee to find out the room in which Angelique was located. He ran into a guy who was horrified to see the president barking in which room his wife was in. Leah's accomplice pushed the keys to the Audi towards Angelique, to which she, playing along with him, asked how much Mrs. Leah gets then. He chuckled and said that she is a queen. Leia is no match for her. If there is cooperation, then she will receive all sorts of benefits. Angelica thought to herself about how the employee of her company earned money. Well, it's okay. She'll figure it out later. Smiling disgustingly, the director hands the girls a glass of wine, offering to celebrate their collaboration. Angelica pretended to drop the phone, and the fake director obsequiously ducked under the table to get it. The girl quickly swapped the glasses, slipping hers to the rogue. They clinked glasses and started drinking wine. She carefully watched how the man drank and what his reaction was. He, in turn, smiling greasily, expected a wonderful night with this beauty. Angelica, smiling sweetly, praised the wine, and her companion noted that as soon as everything was done, he would give her a new Audi. He was noticeably uneasy. His speech was slurred. He hiccuped and swayed. Suddenly, Edward burst into the room, kicking down the door. Before our heroine had time to be surprised, her ex-husband kicked the director, who fell to the floor. Angelica stood with her eyes widened in surprise, unable to open her mouth. Edward yelled at her that there was a drug in the wine, asking if she drank it. The girl wondered whether he was watching her, waiting for the moment to save her, or whether he accidentally ended up in this building. The director, swaying, rose to his feet and wanted to justify himself for what happened. How he got punched in the face again, this time from Chuck, who flew into the room. While the guy was beating the director, Angelica asked him to stop. Chuck stopped smiling when the director's face was already swollen with swelling. He turned to her, handed her a bouquet of flowers, saying that he had come to work to pick her up, found out that she was here and came here. Watching this picture, Edward felt an unpleasant feeling of jealousy. Angelica replied that she had already learned everything she wanted, but there was no point in beating this bastard anymore. Why would they need trouble? The beaten director came to his senses after seeing the two presidents and realized that he had to leave, since they were here, and the ex-husband was so worried about this Angelica. It means she was still under his protection. Chuck gave him seconds to get away. When he saw the car keys, he threw them after him so as not to become an eyesore. Here Edward intervened, sternly saying how one could behave so carelessly and drink wine from strangers, realizing how dangerous it was. Listening to him scold her, she thought that by doing this he just wanted to teach her a lesson and not save her out of the kindness of his heart. Suddenly, Edward blurted out, "This is the life she was striving for by filing for divorce from him." Angelica felt terribly unpleasant to hear this. Old grievances awoke again. Then she drained her glass in one fell swoop, noting that he was not the person who had the right to discuss her life. And besides, she changed glasses. To his surprise, what was she talking about? The girl noticed that she was here for work. She asked him what the difference was between this director and his family. Edward couldn't comprehend her accusations, trying to understand how she could compare such things. Leaving with Chuck, she told him that in his house, she was in the position of a maid and nothing more. Edward stood there confused when it was she who was his family's maid. At that moment, the realization came to him that he didn't know a lot about her. Walking down the hall, he heard the director complaining to his accomplice that the girl was prepared and knew everything. Edward walked and thought that Angelica did not need him, and apparently she never needed him. Angelica was driving in the car, also thinking that Edward didn't know her at all. Chuck broke the silence by noting that he saved her. She was grateful to him, to which the girl replied that she could give her some money. Chuck joked that this was the first time a woman had thrown money at him, but he would prefer her as his girlfriend. Angelica said that she always considered him as a friend, and he had no chance. Chuck was spraying that he would prove to her how suitable a person he was for her. Angelica waved her hand, thinking that his passion would last no more than a month. Chuck smiled, thinking that he would not let anyone near her and would achieve her reciprocity. The next morning, Leia, in Angelica's office, nervously continued to convince her of cooperation with the front company. The vice president looked at the employee, amazed at her persistence. Angelica silently took out her phone and turned on the recording of the conversation when Leia advised him to switch sides and discuss the director's attitude towards her. Then she added that if she transfers this recording to the right place to check Miss Leah's projects, she will be put behind bars. The woman got scared and, kneeling down, began asking Angelica to forgive her rashness, admitting that the project she was trying to drag her into belonged to a shell company. Angelica pretended to forgive, thinking that she could pull out a bigger fish through this employee, but for now she would keep an eye on her. Louis tried to persuade Edward to take him to a restaurant for couples that had opened not far from his establishment, worried that he would lose his customers. Suddenly, a friend sitting with a girl called out to them from the table, calling them to join them. He joked to Louis that he came to investigate, worried that he would steal his clients. They sat down at a friend's table when Chuck saw the couple, recognizing his friend's ex-wife in the girl. She sat with Chuck, chatting nicely and drinking wine. The young man placed in front of her a bouquet of her favorite Swiss royal lilies. Angelica was touched, noting that it was immediately clear that the restaurant was his. The service here was first class. Actually, Chuck bought them for her personally, but decided to remain silent when he asked if she received flowers from him at work. The girl nodded affirmatively, asking in honor of what he sent, to which Chuck said that he was caring for her. Angelica asked not to waste time and energy on her. Louis and Edward did not take their eyes off them, but their friend's phrase about how young Chuck could pay attention to such a woman made Edward angry. Chuck invited Angelica to dance on the dance floor, so it was a friendly dance. He gallantly extended his hand. Angelica thought that if she refused, she would attract attention, so she agreed. The music started playing and they started dancing. They were the only couple on the dance floor. Edward watched his ex-wife dance with President Chuck Jr., and suddenly, his eyes and Chuck's eyes met. Chuck smiled at him without words, showing that the one you so easily refused was now his. To annoy Edward even more, he put his hand on the girl's waist and lowered it lower. Edward at that moment was experiencing a storm of emotions that were tearing him apart from the inside. Why did Chuck lean over pretending to kiss his partner? Since she had her back to Edward, it looked exactly like that. When the music died down and they stopped, couples gathered around the dance floor applauding them. Chuck hugged Angelica and they left. Although the girl moved perfectly to the music, Louis refused to admit it to himself. He believed that she was nothing more than a hunter of rich men. Their friend at the table called her an intriguer who quickly found herself rich, at which Edward began to seethe. The friend continued, "She is an old, faded woman. Finally, all her friends were waiting for this. They never liked her." And he remembered how Angelica called him when after the wedding she and Edward were drinking, and she called to check. But the words about how he put his ex in her place that night, telling her not to meddle in men's affairs and to know her place, made Edward jump, slam his fist on the table, and order them to close. Edward angrily said that he is the head of the Grand Family, and no one dares to discuss members of his family, even former ones. The guys who tried to support their friend through male solidarity were shocked by this reaction. This was not the first time Louis had seen such a reaction when people spoke negatively about his ex-wife. He caught up with his friend and asked him to take their friend's words to heart. They were all like brothers. Edward thought about how everyone around him hated Angelica. Apparently because of this, she treats him this way. Edward remarked on not being angry at them, thinking that he was angry at himself. He told Louis that he could close his restaurant. He couldn't handle it, and went to the car. In the evening, Angelica and her brother were at a business party to sign an important contract. Some guests were discussing them. The girls did not take their eyes off Eugene. He had long been an eligible bachelor, but his companion attracted even more attention. The girls recognized her as the ex-wife of President Edward. How could he lose such a beauty? Eugene kept receiving compliments about his beautiful companion. Eugene whispered to his sister that the president of the company, Julie, with whom they wanted to get a contract, needed to go up. They were watched by a startled Laura and her friend. When the girl noticed that her ex-sister-in-law was beautiful, Laura turned black with envy when she saw her wearing a Louis Vuitton dress, which she could not buy, since it was only one copy and had already been reserved at that time. Therefore, she irritably answered her friend that she was simply looking for another sponsor who would support her for the rest of her life. Eugene and Angelica went up to the upper hall, where the president of Julie's company was 26-year-old Elvis Norton, an aristocratic-looking young man. They greeted him. Eugene introduced Angelica as the vice president of the company. The guy, with the air of a taster, appreciated the girl and complimented her exquisite beauty. Elvis, while talking to the girl, noticed if she was offended that he first canceled with them and now invited them to the party. Angelica assured that she was very glad to be here. The young president asked Eugene for permission to speak with his vice president alone. The girl promised her brother to give it her all and get a cooperation agreement. Elvis stood with the narcissistic air of a conqueror of peaks, casually and playfully holding a glass in his hand, and asked why Angelica wanted to collaborate with his company. The girl replied that her conditions were transparent, and among all the investors, she did not see a better company than his. The young man carefully examined Angelica, noting that her words were far-sighted and courageous. He then asked how she viewed trilateral collaborations with other companies. The girl tensed up and asked which companies. Edward stood next to them. So, the Grand Company is a shareholder of Julie's company, which develops advanced artificial intelligence technologies. The president of the company, Julie, interrupting her thoughts, noted that he would not represent Mr. Grand. They already knew each other. Angelica asked Mr. Elvis why he needed a third party if he was already collaborating with such a large investor as Grand. Edward answered instead, saying that artificial intelligence is a new field and his company cannot take all the risks on itself. Elvis and Edward raised their glasses, waiting for Angelica's answer. Her ex-husband said that she would not be mistaken if she chose this project. Angelica appreciated his advice. He was right. This is a huge profit. You cannot allow others to make money from this because of personal hostility and grievances. And they clinked glasses as a sign of cooperation. President Julie invited Edward and Angelique to dance their first dance as an opening celebration of Julie's anniversary and their collaboration together. Angelica abruptly walked away irritably, saying that she couldn't dance, and Elvis noted that cooperation would not be easy. Edward was not offended. Everything he heard from his friends in the restaurant was that she had gone through enormous difficulties with him. Going down to her brother, who was waiting for the result of the negotiations, Angelica told what cooperation the president had proposed to Julie. The brother reassured her, assuring her that the risks were distributed and the benefits outweighed the possible damage. They benefited from such cooperation. Angelica warmly thanked her brother for his support. They were watched by Edward and Elvis, who, like everyone else, was surprised by Mr. Eugene, who was not interested in women. And then they appear with Miss Angelica. He continued to wonder out loud whether they were hiding their relationship. Then, looking at Edward's tense face, he quietly said that everything was fine. He was there and would support him. At this time, the presenter announced the beginning of the anniversary celebration of the company and Julie. Edward and Angelica's faces changed when they were invited from the stage to open the dance. Edward approached her and bowed and asked permission to invite her to dance. Angelica had no choice but to give him her hand and go to the dance floor. Everyone present was looking at them. Edward led her by the hand, thinking that they didn't really have a wedding. He realized that this was the first time they were holding hands. They walked onto the dance floor while the guests looked at them with admiration, admiring the beautiful couple. The dance began, hugging his ex-wife. Edward felt the aroma of her perfume, and a tender feeling spread throughout his body. Angelica had the same thoughts, that now they were closer than ever in marriage. They danced to the rhythm of the music in unison, thinking about each other and discovering each other. Edward whispered to her with an underdress, "Why did she lie? That she couldn't dance?" To which the girl told him that it depends on the person you're dancing with. They had a quiet dialogue while dancing. Edward was surprised at her ability to conduct business. The girl countered by answering that he still didn't know much about her. The dance was coming to an end. The music began to fade. Edward, bending her over in the final movement, did not notice how he leaned towards her. Their eyes met. He almost kissed her. The spectators looked on in emotion. A roar rang through the hall that they almost kissed as they looked at each other. Angeli went to her brother, and he looked and thought how close she was to him now. Elvis, smiling, took his arm. Edward told him that he understood everything. It was his idea. Angelique met Chuck, noticing that he was late for opening. He began to flirt, saying that he was only here for her, to which Angelica replied that he was here because his father forced him. While they were discussing the events, someone called the girl's name in a hysterical voice. Furious, Laura shouted at her that she had neither shame nor conscience. Flirting with her brother like that, she would never end up in their family again. Angelica rolled her eyes, thinking what kind of kindergarten, when Chuck asked who this rude person is, who has no manners. Laura ordered her lover not to interfere at all. The guy beamed. Wow, he was introduced to the status of a lover. Our heroine asked Laura what she needed. She squealed for Angelica to stop pursuing her brother. Then she triumphantly declared, "His heart is occupied by Ursula, just like that, and she is just a means for a blood transfusion, so don't even dream of returning to the family." Angelica loudly said that the whole world knows about the affair between her brother and Ursula, so it is no longer news that he is a scoundrel who cheated on his wife. The women who surrounded them wailed what a shame. How disgusting it was to cheat on your wife and not even hide it. Ursula, realizing that she had revealed the unpleasant side of her, pointed her finger at Angelica and said that she was selling herself to men, after which she stated that her brother's ex-wife continues to clinch money from him. She is nobody and nothing, an ordinary maid who does not have a penny to her name. Edward heard his sister's words with rage in his eyes and wanted to kill her on the spot. Lara, realizing that she had revealed everything that Edward did not know, confusedly tried to justify herself that she was simply teaching the impudent woman a lesson. Chuck contemptuously replied that even if he continued to spill out the disgusting details of his family, Angelica was truly unlucky to be a part of all this. When Laura began accusing him of having affairs with Angelique, Edward barked and ordered her to shut up. He loudly asked if it was all true what she had just said about what role Angelica occupied in his family. Angelica publicly answered that everything said was the pure truth. People groaned when they heard this. The divorce turned out to be even more scandalous than they wrote about it, poor Angelica. Edward was shocked to realize that it was not only his friends who were bullying his wife, but his family as well. Angelica asked him, well, he now knows the truth and what? Make his sister and mother kneel in front of her and apologize. Edward looked at the girl in confusion when she added that he could do it for them. Laura twisted with anger, and she asked who Angelica was so that she and her brother would apologize. Edward silenced her. Laura was hysterical why he was on the side of this boorish woman, and Edward understood that besides money, he could not offer anything as an apology. But she clearly doesn't need them. He tried to say something, but didn't know how to formulate it. Angelica told him to stop making a guilty face in public if he doesn't have the courage to apologize. Although these apologies cost nothing, then it's time to stop this farce. Then, glancing at Laura, she added that his sister had already disgraced her family enough by publicly admitting how the Grand family abused their son's wife by holding her as a servant. Laura stated that she was trying to seduce her brother. Angelica laughed and said, did she really think that she needed Edward? Then Angelica publicly said in front of everyone that 3 years ago, when she married Mr. Grand, she was blind and would not make such a mistake again. And she added words that made Edward sway, that if she had to seduce every man in this world, she would never return to Mr. Edward. Then she turned around and walked away, followed by Chuck with a grin, looking at Edward and how Angelica did him. Elvis turned to the guests to diffuse the situation, to have fun and dance. Admiring men came up to express their respect for such courage from Miss Angelica. Our heroine was flattered and thanked them for their support. Angelica drank with those who wanted to support her and express admiration. Chuck approached her and asked if the lady needed help. The girl smiled shyly and replied that she had actually had a little too much to drink. Chuck asked her why Laura said she tried to seduce Edward today. Another of the admiring young men approached them with an offer to drink to Miss Angelica. Chuck grabbed the glass from him, saying that the lady had already drunk a lot today, so he would drink this glass for her. Angelica went to the restroom, standing at the sink. She washed her hands. The water made her feel better. She heard two people going to the restroom, talking loudly and calling Angelica a bitch. It was not difficult to understand that it was Laura and her friend. The girl wiped her hands with a paper towel, looking at them in the mirror. They did not immediately notice her. Miss Grand attacked Angelica with irritation, noting that she was haunted by her failure to constantly face her. Angelica snorted and replied that she also thought so when Laura attacked her with a stream of insults, that no matter what outfits she wore, she would always be a poor woman and a non-entity living at the expense of men. Angelica told her that she continued to look for problems for herself, but she remained silent in public about Laura's past, and there was nothing special to be proud of. Angelica felt free and relaxed, which was unusual for Laura, which is why she did not stop humiliating the girl. She looked at Angelica standing, thinking that she had never liked her. That's why she humiliated her, and that she was still a poor woman and had to pacify her anger and endure. Then, hitting the patient, Laura called Angelica a walking jar of blood who married her brother in order to make money from it. After these words, a veil seemed to fall over Angelica. Laura did not heed the warning to close her mouth, but she continued to insult the girl as a beggar and a corrupt woman. Angelica suddenly threw a glass of cold water in her face. Laura screamed. She held the wet dress in anger, declaring how dare she stain her Dior. She raised her hand to hit Angelica. When she intercepted the blow with a sharp movement, she twisted her hand painfully and said that she was no longer the one who suffered humiliation. Now she will clean her dirty mouth and teach her a lesson in good manners. Taking Laura by the hair, she plunged her head into a sink of water. Her friend, pale with horror, did not even try to intervene. Holding his head under water, he pulled it out of the sink with the same sharp movement. Laura whined, and her friend tried to help her somehow. Angelica looked with satisfaction at the lesson presented. Then, turning beautifully, she added that if Miss Laura did not calm down, the lesson would be even tougher. Laura really looked at her in fear, not believing her eyes. Could it really be that Angelica who lived in their house? In the corridor, she met Edward, who tried to talk to the girl. He asked why she divorced without a reason, but it was probably too late to ask for an answer. He tried to explain about Ursula, whom he sent out of the city, but the girl interrupted him with irritation, noting that she did not want to listen to all this abomination again. She told him that from now on they were strangers. Eugene was waiting for her in the hall, offering to go home, since the girl was clearly tired. Having hugged his sister, he led her to the exit. Chuck followed them, but Eugene stopped the guy's attempts. The wealthy couple is suspected of renewing their romance, and a photo of Edward and Angelica during a dance was circulating online and in comments this morning. This post was sent to her by friends in a chat. Angelica, frowning, deleted it. Then she learned from Martha that Chuck had spent millions to remove a hot headline from the internet. He asked her to accompany his artist friend to the auction, since he himself could not because of business. She was sitting at a charity auction with an artist, a nice guy who offered to order her a snack. Angelica thanked her, refusing to eat as she was not hungry. Looking around the hall, she saw Laura and Grace, who were sitting with their backs to them and could not see. At this moment, the presenter announced the next exhibit from Madame and Miss Grand, an emerald pipe with a starting price of $3 million. Angelica gasped. This is a family heirloom inherited from her ancestors. This is the treasure of old Mr. Grand and is very dear to him. She remembered how she once accidentally touched her when she was cleaning the hall and spent the whole night on her knees in front of her mother-in-law, who scolded her all night. Angelica thought that many would not even dream of just looking at this pipe, but Grace actually put it up for auction. Angelica smiled and decided to play with them. When they announced a price of $3 million, she bet on $10 million. Laura and Grace jumped as if scalded when they saw Angelique smiling. Grace understood that no one would dare to bid for this pipe. She just wanted to do everything necessary to participate, put the pipe up, and then buy it back. She screamed furiously that she was giving $11 million. Angelica raised the bid to $12 million. Mother and daughter looked in fury and horror and did not understand what she wanted. Grace, like a bundle of nerves, raised the bet to 13 million, hoping that the scoundrel would run out of limits. Angelica calmly offered 15 million. Laura quickly shouted that she gave 20 million. Angelica didn't want to intimidate them. She just wanted to get what she wanted by calling the bid 30 million. Grace and Laura angrily thought that she was the one who deliberately spoke out against them. They didn't have more than 10 million on their deposit. Angelica was announced as the owner of the pipe. She stood up and waved. They brought the treasured pipe to Angelica, packaged, and asked her to check the integrity and sign for it. The girl, who knew this thing well, looked inside and, seeing a small red spot, was convinced of its authenticity. As she was about to leave, Grace made claims of ignoring and disrespecting her elders. She turned to them, while the former mother-in-law reproached that if a rich sponsor appeared, this was not a reason to disrespect older family members. Angelica chuckled and noted that Mrs. Grace was experiencing memory deterioration with age, since she no longer had anything to do with their family, and she was not her mother-in-law. Laura demanded that she treat her elders with respect. Angelica, looking into her eyes, coldly noticed that she apparently intended to teach her a lesson. Grace understood that old Mr. Grand would not forgive her for this. She offered Angelique 30 million for the pipe, to which Angelica cheerfully said that if they had 30 million, they would have bought her out themselves. Then she loudly added that she bought the phone legally for real money, and everyone can confirm this. Angelica said that she was happy. If she was happy, she could afford such things. Having paid with an unlimited black platinum card, she signed. At that moment, Edward entered the hall. When he approached, the deal had already been completed. His mother and sister ran up to him, babbling that his ex had bought his grandfather's favorite pipe. He yelled at them, "How dare they take the old gentleman's thing and bring it to auction?" Angelica turned around and walked towards the exit, declaring that she would not interfere with the family reunion. Former relatives started babbling that she could not carry this thing with her. Then Angelica waved them documents confirming that she was now the rightful owner. And she added, looking at her former mother-in-law, that she should look for a place to live, since old Mr. Grand might now throw her out of the house. The mother-in-law said why she bullied her, to which Angelica replied that the Grand family's favorite thing to do was bully her. Edward asked how much she wanted for the pipe. Angelica smiled and replied that it looked like she didn't have enough money, saying that this was just the beginning. A secretary came to Angelica in the morning with a bouquet of red roses, saying that Mr. Grand was inviting her to a business dinner. She ordered to throw away the bouquet, and from now on not to ask her if requests for dinner come from the Grand, to immediately refuse. The secretary noticed that the bouquet was from Mr. Chuck. The girl still ordered to throw it away. When Chuck ran in and offendedly asked not to break her heart, he specially bred this type of roses for her. Angelica asked him what he was doing in the office, to which the guy replied that he wanted to invite her to dinner. He pouted offendedly, saying that she was now in his debt. The girl agreed, and in the evening after work they went to a restaurant and ran into Edward and Louis. Louis sarcastically remarked that because of the new gentleman, she had no time to accept invitations to have dinner with Edward. Angelica retorted that he was very interested in her personal life. Would Mr. Lewis want to invite her on a date? In response to his outburst that he did not look at women like her, she said that she was demanding of male physique standards, and his body did not meet them. The girl publicly recalled how he ran out naked after betting on a bet. Lewis flushed and thought that he would have killed her if it weren't for the incriminating evidence in her hands. Chuck suggested that Angelica go out to dinner before they spoil their appetite. When they ate, Angelica realized that she was a little tipsy and said that she was going to the restroom to wash her hands. Walking down the corridor, she swayed a little. Edward walked around the corner. When they ran into each other, Edward wanted to talk to her, but Angelica annoyedly said that she was already leaving. To his persuasion, she replied that for all work issues he could contact her assistant. Edward again started bidding on the pipe, asking her to name any price, to which the girl replied that this topic was closed and she was ignoring him. Meanwhile, Chuck was looking for her, saying that a car had pulled up. The girl said that she forgot her bag. Then Chuck offered to go get her and let her wait in the car. While waiting for Chuck in the parking lot, she saw Edward and Louis walking. They did not see her. Having heard that the men were talking about Ursula returning from abroad, Louis noticed that he missed her. She had been gone for a long time. Even though she did wrong, she was one of them, and the punishment was too cruel. Angelica clenched her fists. They call being sent abroad punishment. She will show her what real punishment is. When they arrived at Angelica's mansion, it was already late. Chuck saw that the girl was upset about something. Then he took her hand and told her not to worry about that scoundrel Edward. He doesn't deserve it. And she is his queen. Chuck spoke with tenderness in his voice, without a hint of obscenity, with genuine concern. Angelica was a little embarrassed and surprised, but she wasn't ready for a relationship yet. Our heroine joked that crowds of girls were running after him, but apparently they weren't enough for him. Louis replied that he only needed one, and looking at the girl, said goodbye and went home. Left alone in the living room, she noticed the pipe she had bought and decided to take a photo of it. A couple of minutes later, she posted a post on the internet with a call to evaluate and like her new acquisition. The next morning, entering her office, she saw her former father-in-law and Laura. He remarked to her that she never learned good manners when entering the office. Angelica walked to her chair and sat down in it, noticing that she did not have the habit of knocking when entering her office. The elderly chairman, having recovered from what he had heard, said that he had underestimated her abilities. It is clear why she initiated the divorce and found a new, wealthy family. Angelica answered him condescendingly, demonstrating that his power no longer affected her, that she no longer intended to listen to him on her knees as before. Laura attacked her as she was talking to her grandfather. Where were her manners? Angela sat proudly in a chair and said that in her office there are no juniors and seniors. There are only bosses and subordinates. Then Miss Grand began to reproach her that grandfather was old, and with her behavior she could give him a heart attack, to which Angelica calmly replied that this was not her grandfather. Then the elderly gentleman demanded that Angelica name her price and sell the pipe, to which the girl, laughing, declared the futility of their intentions. Even if they kneeled down, they would not receive it. Laura screamed that she hated their family and was doing all this on purpose. Angelica answered her coldly, looking into her eyes that everything was true. She was far from the kindest and weakest person in the world. Then Mr. Grand said that he would call the chairman and tell him that his son was dating a divorced woman. Angelica replied that they should try. She would enjoy this picture. When Mr. Grand was dialing, Laura was jubilant. Now they will show this upstart. He dialed the president and said that he wanted to talk to him. The man said that he was actually fishing right now. Angelica could barely contain her laughter. They wanted to complain about her to her own father. The elderly Grand started talking about whether he knew that his son Eugene had become intimate with a divorced woman, to which Angelica's father innocently replied that he had no idea, but his son is a young man. It is not surprising that he was attracted to a woman. Laura's grandfather said irritably that she was a divorced woman, and his son promoted her to vice president of the company. Doesn't this fact bother him? Angelica's father advised the chairman to worry about his family and the pipe that his ex-daughter-in-law had recently bought. And having said that he had a big catch on the hook and hung up, Edward's father stood in amazement. He then said that Angelica was lucky this time, but did she really think about becoming part of this family? To which the girl confidently replied that she did not think, but knew that she would become part of this family. Then she called the guards, ordering them to take these people away and no longer allow strangers into her office. When leaving, Old Man Grand promised her that since she did not agree in a good way, she would do it in a bad way. When they left, the girl called her father asking how many fish he caught, and they laughed together at the recent dialogue. Angelica laughingly told how they came to her office and complained about her right in front of her. At this time, the secretary came and said that President Elvis from Julie was inviting him to a business dinner. The girl said that she would come for dinner. Arriving for dinner, she met a smiling President Julie and her ex-husband. Angelica got angry, thinking that he decided to become a mediator and set her up with her ex every time. Sitting down at the table, the girl noted that Mr. Elvis had lured her into a trap. Then she added, looking at Edward, that if we talk about the pipe again, he might forget. Edward told her not to take his grandfather's words seriously. Angelica thought, if he needs this tube so much, why not? She asked President Julie to leave her and Edward alone. The girl looked at her former husband and stated her conditions. Within a year, Ursula must return to her as much of her blood as she had donated to her for all 3 years. Edward was taken aback and unable to say anything. Angelica continued that Ursula did not deserve her blood. She returned the money to Edward and should get her blood back. Edward asked if Angelica would return the phone to him if Ursula fulfilled the conditions, to which Angelica said that time would tell. Edward met Ursula at the airport. She hung on Edward, trying to figure out if he missed her. In the car, he stunned her with the news that she would have to return Angelica's blood within a year. Ursula whined and said in a wailing voice that she had been punished enough. She might as well just apologize to her. Then, pressing on Edward's pity, she remembered his late army friend. Would he allow him to mock her like that? Edward thought he'd talk to Angelique to see if she could agree to a 3-year term. At this moment, Ursula harbored thoughts about Angelica's death. Edward came to work with Angelica, to which she noticed that it seemed like he had nothing to do. Edward asked her to extend the deadline for returning the blood by 3 years, since it would be extremely difficult for Ursula to do it in a year. Angelica was hurt by what she heard, which means he feels sorry for Ursula and how hard it will be for her. The girl picked up the phone and said that she agreed. Before Edward could rejoice, she dropped it on the floor. Another moment and the pipe, broken into pieces, lay on the office floor. Angelica said that he could take his thing. Edward was escorted out by security. He was indignant but could not utter a word. After he was taken out of the office, Angelica's assistant came up and reported that unpleasant rumors were being spread about her. He reported that they were talking about her, that Mr. Eugene was keeping her as his mistress, and at the same time she was sleeping with Mr. Chuck. There was also gossip that the Grand family threw her out, and these rumors were started by Leia, who was going to the salon for a party today. Angelica, in a luxurious outfit, was waiting for her employee, deciding to teach a lesson and enjoy the show. The girl looked for her and noticed a table where Leia was discussing her with other girls. She heard her name and the fact that she was spoken of as a poor mistress. One of the girls was indignant at such a fall. It was time to look in the mirror and realize what she was doing. Leah added, "Well, who would marry a divorcee with an unknown past, who is only capable of jumping in men's beds?" Angelica stood behind with a wine glass, declaring how much news she had just heard about herself. And she's popular, since she doesn't leave the lips. Leia broke out in a cold sweat, babbling that it was so unexpected to see her here. Her companions froze. Angelica, pouring wine on the gossiper's head, said, "These are not coincidences. She came here on purpose." Leia jumped up screaming what Angelica was doing. She must be sick in the head. Her friends began to demand that the guards take Angelica out. What right did she have to come to where she was not invited? Angelica took Leah's hand, saying that she had prepared a special gift for her, and this was not a recording of that conversation. A minute later, a video appeared on the screen in which Leia was engaged in lovemaking with a man. The women groaned in disgust. Someone said that this was the director, whose wife was present today, and recognized her husband in the video.